Most people think life-changing decisions happen after long discussions. Sometimes they happen in the 5 seconds it takes to decide whether to keep something that does not belong to you. Ethan Brooks never expected an ordinary Tuesday afternoon to test that idea. The 40-year-old single father had just finished a maintenance shift at a downtown office complex and was heading toward the city bus stop when he noticed something unusual near a bench outside a coffee shop. At first glance, it looked like an expensive leather travel bag. Dark brown. Immaculately crafted. The kind of item most people would notice immediately. Yet dozens of pedestrians walked past without paying attention. Ethan slowed his pace and stopped beside it. For a moment, he simply stood there. The sidewalk remained crowded. Traffic moved steadily through the intersection. Nobody appeared to be looking for a missing bag. Nobody seemed concerned. Ethan glanced around one more time before carefully picking it up. It felt heavier than expected. Not extremely heavy. Just substantial enough to suggest there was something important inside. He looked toward the coffee shop windows. Several customers sat inside talking. Others worked on laptops. Nobody reacted. The bag remained unclaimed. Ethan could have walked away. Plenty of people would have. Instead, he carried it to a nearby table and examined the exterior. No visible identification. No luggage tag. No business card attached to the handle. Just high-quality leather and a small silver clasp. For a brief second, curiosity whispered the same question it whispers to everyone. What is inside? Ethan looked at the clasp. Then looked away. The answer would have been easy to discover. Too easy. He picked up the bag and continued toward the bus stop. Across town, 12-year-old Lily Brooks sat at the kitchen table finishing homework while waiting for her father to return home. The apartment was modest but comfortable. Family photographs lined one wall. School projects occupied another. Everything about the space reflected years of careful effort. Ethan arrived shortly before sunset carrying groceries in one hand and the leather bag in the other. Lily immediately noticed it. "What is that?" she asked. Ethan placed the bag carefully on the counter. "Something somebody lost." Lily looked curious. "Did you look inside?" Ethan smiled and shook his head. "No." Lily seemed surprised. "Not even a little?" Ethan laughed softly. "Not even a little." She studied the bag for a moment. "What if there is something important in there?" Ethan opened a cabinet and began putting away groceries. "That is exactly why it is not mine to open." Lily nodded thoughtfully. The answer seemed simple enough. Yet even she could tell the bag was unusual. Later that evening, while preparing dinner, Ethan searched online lost and found listings and local community groups. Nothing. No reports. No announcements. No mention of a missing bag. Hours passed. The mystery only deepened. Before going to bed, Ethan placed the bag on a shelf near the front door. The silver clasp reflected the soft light from the hallway. He looked at it one final time. Then turned away. What Ethan did not know was that somewhere else in the city, a billionaire was beginning to realize something extremely important had disappeared. And before the week ended, that forgotten bag would connect two lives that could not have seemed more different. By sunrise the next morning, the leather bag was still sitting exactly where Ethan Brooks had left it. Untouched. Unopened. The silver clasp reflected the soft morning light coming through the apartment window. While Lily prepared for school, Ethan poured coffee and checked local websites again. Lost property groups. Community forums. Transportation reports. Still nothing. It did not make sense. Something about the bag suggested importance. The quality alone made that obvious. Yet nobody seemed to be looking for it. Lily glanced toward the shelf while putting books into her backpack. Maybe the owner does not know it is missing yet. Ethan nodded. Maybe. She studied him for a moment. You are still curious. Ethan laughed quietly. A little. Lily smiled. Me too. Despite that curiosity, neither moved toward the bag. The decision had already been made. It belonged to someone else. Across the city, however, a very different morning was unfolding. Richard Sterling sat at the head of a conference table surrounded by advisors, executives, and security personnel. Normally calm under pressure, he looked unusually distracted. Several people in the room noticed immediately. The billionaire rarely allowed personal matters to affect business meetings. Today was different. A member of his security team entered and quietly handed him a report. Richard reviewed it without speaking. His expression remained controlled, but the room seemed to grow more tense. Finally, one executive asked the obvious question. Any updates? Richard placed the report on the table. No. The answer was short. Final. Nobody pressed further. The meeting continued, yet his attention remained elsewhere. Hours later, after school ended, Lily walked home with her father through a neighborhood park. The bag remained the subject neither could completely ignore. What if somebody offers a reward? Lily asked. Ethan smiled. That is not really the point. She nodded. I know. Then she looked thoughtful. But it would be nice. Ethan laughed. That is probably true. Their conversation ended when Ethan's phone vibrated. A news alert appeared on the screen. He almost ignored it. Then a familiar detail caught his eye. The article described an unnamed business leader searching for a missing personal item. No photograph. No detailed description. Just a brief mention that the item held exceptional personal value. Ethan read the article twice. Something felt connected. Later that evening, after Lily finished homework, Ethan examined the exterior of the bag once again. This time he noticed something he had missed before. Embossed inside the leather handle was a small manufacturer marking followed by a serial number. Tiny. Nearly invisible. The discovery was not dramatic, but it gave him something useful. A lead. Within minutes he was researching the manufacturer. The company specialized in custom luxury travel goods. Very expensive. Very exclusive. More importantly, every item could be traced. Ethan leaned back in his chair. For the first time since finding the bag, he felt genuinely close to identifying the owner. Across town. Richard Sterling stood alone inside a private office overlooking the city skyline. He stared through the glass while holding a photograph taken many years earlier. The missing bag was not valuable because of money. In fact, its most important contents could never be replaced at any price. Somewhere in the city, the one thing he wanted back more than any business asset remained missing. Neither Richard nor Ethan knew it yet, but their paths were already moving toward the same destination. The serial number changed everything. Until that moment, Ethan Brooks had been searching blindly. Now he had a direction. Thursday evening found him sitting at the small kitchen table while Lily worked on a science project nearby. The leather bag remained untouched on the shelf. Days had passed, yet neither curiosity nor opportunity had convinced him to open it. Instead, he focused on finding the owner. After several phone calls and online searches, Ethan finally reached a customer service representative from the luxury manufacturer. The conversation was polite but limited. Privacy rules prevented them from revealing ownership information. However, after hearing the situation, the representative agreed to pass along Ethan's contact details if the registered owner reported the item missing. It was not a complete solution, but it was progress. Ethan thanked her and ended the call. Lily immediately looked up from her project. Did it work? Ethan shrugged. Maybe. She smiled. That means yes. Ethan laughed softly. That means we wait. Across the city, waiting had become increasingly difficult for Richard Sterling. The Billionaire's security team had exhausted nearly every lead. Surveillance footage from several locations had been reviewed. Staff members had been interviewed. Transportation records had been checked. Yet the missing bag remained unaccounted for. The problem was no longer simply finding an object. The problem was uncertainty. Nobody knew whether it had been stolen, discarded, misplaced, or discovered by someone honest enough to return it. That final possibility seemed increasingly unlikely to several members of his team. Richard remained unconvinced. Something about the situation felt different. Late Friday morning, Ethan received a phone call while repairing a fence at work. The number was unfamiliar. He answered anyway. A calm professional voice introduced herself as a representative acting on behalf of the registered owner of the bag. Ethan listened carefully. The woman asked several questions about where and when he found it. Ethan answered each one. Then came a pause. The owner would like to speak with you directly. Ethan looked surprised. Now? If possible. Several seconds later another voice came onto the line. Older. Controlled. Confident. Richard Sterling introduced himself without mentioning wealth, business, or status. He simply sounded like someone relieved to have found a lead. Ethan explained how he discovered the bag and the steps he took to locate the owner. Richard listened without interruption. Finally, he asked one question. You never opened it? Ethan glanced toward the fence he had been repairing. No. Silence followed. Not suspicious silence. Genuine surprise. Richard thanked him and suggested a meeting to verify ownership and retrieve the bag. Ethan agreed. The conversation ended politely. Only afterward did Ethan search the name online. Within seconds, dozens of articles appeared. Interviews. Business profiles. Corporate headlines. Lily found him staring at the phone screen later that evening. Who owns the bag? She asked. Ethan turned the screen toward her. Her eyes widened immediately. That guy? Ethan nodded. Lily looked from the screen to the shelf where the bag still sat. You found a billionaire's bag? Ethan smiled. Looks that way. Lily stared at the bag for a long moment. Then she asked the question almost everyone else would have asked days earlier. Do you think there is money inside? Ethan laughed. I honestly have no idea. The truth was even more surprising. Because when they finally met the following day, both Ethan and Lily would discover that the most valuable thing inside the bag was not money at all. Saturday arrived with clear skies and an unusual amount of nervous energy inside the Brooks apartment. Ethan Brooks was not worried about meeting a billionaire. At least that was what he told himself. Yet he found himself checking the address twice before leaving. The meeting location was not a corporate headquarters or a luxury hotel. Richard Sterling had requested a private office attached to one of his foundation buildings downtown. Quiet. Neutral. Discreet. Ethan preferred that. Lily sat in the passenger seat as they drove through the city. Do you think there will be security guards? She asked. Ethan smiled. Probably. A lot of them? Ethan laughed softly. Maybe. Lily grinned and looked out the window. The entire situation felt unreal. Less than a week earlier, the mysterious leather bag had been sitting beside a public bench. Now they were driving to meet one of the most successful business leaders in the country. When they arrived, Lily immediately noticed two security professionals standing near the entrance. Their expressions remained polite but serious. As Ethan carried the bag toward the building, one of them stepped forward. Mr. Brooks? Ethan nodded. This way. The process was professional. Identification was checked. Questions were asked. Documentation was reviewed. Nobody acted rude. Yet the message felt clear. Ethan was being evaluated. Every answer. Every movement. Every detail. One security officer glanced at the bag. "You never opened it?" Ethan shook his head. "No." The officer looked genuinely surprised. Most people would have. Ethan simply shrugged. Several minutes later, they entered a conference room overlooking the city skyline. Richard Sterling stood beside the windows. The billionaire looked older in person than he did in photographs. Not weaker. Just more human. Less like a headline. More like a man carrying responsibilities. When Richard saw the bag, something changed in his expression immediately. Relief. Genuine relief. Ethan placed it carefully on the table between them. "I believe this belongs to you." Richard stared at the bag for several seconds before speaking. "Thank you." The words sounded simple, yet carried unusual weight. He moved closer and examined the exterior. Then he looked back at Ethan. "You really never looked inside?" Ethan smiled. "No." Richard shook his head. Slowly. Around the room, several members of his staff exchanged quiet glances. The answer seemed impossible to them. One advisor finally spoke. "You had possession of it for almost 5 days." Ethan nodded. "That sounds right." The advisor looked confused. "You were never curious?" Ethan thought about the question. Then he laughed softly. "Of course I was curious." The room grew quiet. "Then why not open it?" Ethan glanced toward Lily. She was sitting calmly in a chair nearby. Then he looked back toward the table. "Because curiosity does not change ownership." Nobody responded immediately. The simplicity of the answer seemed to catch everyone off guard. Richard slowly lowered himself into a chair. For the first time since the meeting began, he appeared less interested in the bag itself and more interested in the man sitting across from him. The security team had expected negotiations. Staff members expected questions. Some even expected demands. Instead, they found a single father who wanted nothing except to return something that was never his. And in that moment, Richard Sterling began realizing that the most surprising discovery of the week might not be inside the bag at all. For several moments after Ethan spoke, the conference room remained completely silent. The statement was so simple that nobody knew how to respond. Curiosity does not change ownership. Richard Sterling looked at the man sitting across from him and realized he had spent most of his life surrounded by people who always wanted something. Business opportunities. Access. Favors. Recognition. Yet Ethan Brooks appeared to want none of those things. He had already returned the bag. The transaction was finished in his mind. Richard finally reached forward and opened the silver clasp. For the first time since the meeting began, everyone in the room looked toward the contents. Ethan did not lean forward. Lily remained seated quietly beside him. Richard carefully removed several items and placed them on the table. Documents. Personal notes. A small leather portfolio. Nothing appeared extraordinary at first glance. Then Richard reached deeper into the bag and removed a thin protective case. The room grew noticeably quieter. He opened it slowly. Inside was an old photograph. Not valuable in any financial sense. The image showed a younger Richard standing beside an elderly woman. Both were smiling. The photograph itself was worn from years of handling. Richard stared at it for several seconds before speaking. "My mother." His voice sounded softer than before. Nobody interrupted. "This was taken 6 months before she passed away." He continued looking at the picture. It is the last photograph we ever took together. Ethan immediately understood. So did Lily. The importance of the bag suddenly made sense. The most valuable thing inside had never been money. It had been memory. Richard carefully returned the photograph to its protective case. Then he looked toward Ethan. If this had disappeared, there would have been no replacement. Ethan nodded quietly. Across the table, several members of Richard's team exchanged thoughtful looks. The story had changed. This was no longer about a billionaire recovering expensive property. It was about recovering something irreplaceable. Richard reached into his jacket and removed a checkbook. Several advisors seemed unsurprised. One security officer even smiled slightly. This was the moment everyone expected. A reward. A substantial one. Richard began writing. Ethan immediately raised a hand. Please do not. Richard paused. You have not even seen the amount. Ethan smiled. That is not really the point. The room became quiet again. Richard studied him carefully. You returned something important. Ethan nodded. Because it was yours. Richard set down the pen without argument. Surprisingly, he respected the answer. Most people would have negotiated. Most people would have calculated value. Ethan had reduced the entire situation to a principle. Ownership. Responsibility. Character. As the meeting continued, Lily quietly observed everything. Eventually Richard noticed her watching the photograph case. Do you know why your father is unusual? Lily smiled. Because he fixes things? Several people laughed softly. Richard nodded. That too. Lily thought for a moment. My dad always says that doing the right thing becomes easier when you decide before the situation happens. Richard leaned back in his chair. The statement sounded remarkably mature for a 12-year-old. Then he smiled. Your father taught you well. The meeting eventually moved toward ordinary conversation. Yet something had changed. Richard no longer viewed Ethan as a stranger who found a missing bag. He viewed him as someone worth understanding. Someone whose values seemed increasingly rare. And as Ethan and Lily prepared to leave, Richard found himself asking a question he had not expected. Not what Ethan wanted, but who Ethan really was. The meeting should have ended there. The bag had been returned. The owner had recovered something irreplaceable. The story seemed complete. Yet during the following week, Richard Sterling found himself thinking about Ethan Brooks far more often than expected. It was not because of the bag. It was because the encounter made no sense according to the rules Richard had spent decades observing. Successful people often claimed integrity. Honest people often accepted rewards. Nearly everyone wanted recognition. Ethan had declined all three without hesitation. That level of consistency was rare. By Wednesday, curiosity finally overcame Richard's restraint. He instructed a trusted assistant to gather publicly available information about Ethan. Nothing invasive. Nothing inappropriate. Just enough to understand who he was. The report arrived 2 days later. Richard reviewed it during a flight home from a business conference. The first page seemed ordinary. Ethan worked maintenance contracts throughout the city. He rented a modest apartment. He raised a daughter alone. The deeper Richard read, however, the more interesting the story became. Ethan's work history revealed something unexpected. Years earlier, he had supervised larger projects. Better-paying projects. Opportunities that could have led to management positions. Yet several times he voluntarily chose flexibility over advancement. One note explained why. Every decision aligned with raising Lily. School schedules. Medical appointments. Parent meetings. Richard slowly lowered the report. The realization struck harder than expected. Ethan had not failed to pursue bigger opportunities. He had deliberately traded them for time with his daughter. Meanwhile, life continued normally for Ethan. Friday afternoon found him repairing lighting fixtures at a community center while Lily attended a school event nearby. Nothing about his routine had changed. He still packed lunches, paid bills, fixed things that broke. The meeting with Richard Sterling felt increasingly distant. Yet unknown to him, several people had begun quietly admiring choices he considered ordinary. Later that evening, Richard drove himself to a small fundraising event sponsored by his foundation. As guests arrived, he found his attention drifting toward a question that refused to disappear. What kind of person returns something valuable without expecting anything in return? More importantly, what kind of person does it consistently enough that even his daughter views it as normal? The following morning, Ethan and Lily visited a neighborhood farmer's market. They spent nearly an hour comparing fruit prices and chatting with local vendors. The outing was simple, comfortable, familiar. At one point Lily spotted a small handcrafted birdhouse and immediately fell in love with it. Ethan checked the price tag and smiled apologetically. Maybe another time. Lily nodded without complaint. They continued walking. Neither noticed a man standing across the street observing from a distance. Richard Sterling had not planned to stop. Yet there he was, watching a father and daughter share an ordinary morning. No luxury. No special treatment. No audience. Just genuine contentment. The scene affected him more than expected. Many people spent their lives chasing larger houses, bigger titles, and greater status. Ethan seemed focused on something entirely different. And somehow, despite having less than many others, he appeared remarkably at peace. As Richard returned to his vehicle, one thought remained with him. The lost bag had revealed far more than the location of a missing photograph. It had revealed the character of the man who found it. And for the first time, Richard began considering whether someone like Ethan belonged in a much larger story than either of them had imagined. The following Monday began like every other Monday in Ethan Brooks's life. An early alarm. A quick breakfast. A lunch packed for Lily before school. The routine never changed much, and Ethan liked it that way. Stability mattered. Especially after years of learning how quickly life could become uncertain. As Lily gathered her books near the apartment door, she noticed her father checking his phone. "Work message?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Looks like it." He glanced at the screen again. The sender surprised him. Richard Sterling. The billionaire had included only a short message. No urgency. No explanation. Just an invitation to lunch later that week if Ethan was available. Lily immediately became interested. "You should go." Ethan smiled. "Maybe." She crossed her arms. "That means yes." Ethan laughed quietly and drove her to school. By Thursday afternoon, curiosity finally convinced him to accept the invitation. The restaurant Richard selected was elegant without being excessive. Private without feeling exclusive. When Ethan arrived, Richard was already seated near a window overlooking the city. The conversation began casually. Family. Work. Everyday topics. Neither man seemed interested in discussing wealth or business. That changed only after lunch arrived. Richard folded his hands and looked directly at Ethan. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan nodded. "Of course." Richard hesitated for a moment. "Have you ever considered doing something different?" Ethan smiled. "Different from what?" "Different from maintenance work." Ethan thought carefully before answering. "Not really." Richard seemed surprised. "Why not?" Ethan looked out the window for a moment. Because my goal was never to become important. Richard leaned back slightly. Ethan continued. My goal was to be present. The answer stayed in the air between them. Richard understood immediately. Every career decision. Every compromise. Every sacrifice. They all pointed toward the same priority. Lily. For years, Ethan had quietly built his life around being available when his daughter needed him. Richard found himself respecting that more with every passing minute. Eventually he decided to reveal the real reason for the invitation. I have been thinking about something since we met. Ethan listened quietly. Richard continued. People spend a lot of time talking about leadership. He paused. But leadership is really trust. Ethan nodded. That sounds right. Richard smiled. And I trust very few people. The statement carried obvious significance. Ethan remained silent. Richard reached into a folder beside his chair and placed several documents on the table. I would like your help. Ethan looked down. The proposal was not a job offer in the traditional sense. It involved community programs sponsored by Richard's foundation. Mentorship initiatives. Scholarship selection panels. Youth development projects. Programs designed to help young people develop responsibility and character. Ethan slowly reviewed the material. Why me? Richard smiled. Because you taught your daughter values that most adults struggle to understand. Ethan looked genuinely uncomfortable with the praise. Richard noticed immediately. It only reinforced his conclusion. The people most deserving of influence rarely seek it. As the meeting ended, Ethan agreed to consider the proposal. Nothing more. Nothing less. Yet while driving home that evening, he found himself thinking about the opportunity. Not because it promised status. Not because it involved a billionaire. But because for the first time, someone had offered him a chance to help others using the principles he had quietly followed his entire life. The proposal remained on Ethan Brooks's kitchen table for nearly a week. Not because he disliked the idea. Not because he doubted Richard Sterling's intentions. The truth was simpler. Ethan had spent years making decisions carefully. Especially decisions that could affect Lily. Every evening after work, he reviewed the foundation documents again. Scholarship programs. Mentorship events. Community projects designed to help young people build character and responsibility. The mission itself appealed to him. What concerned him was time. Time had always been his most valuable resource. One evening while washing dishes, Ethan noticed Lily reading through one of the program brochures. She looked up. You are still thinking about it. Ethan smiled. Maybe. Lily laughed immediately. That means yes. The response sounded so familiar that both of them smiled. Ethan dried his hands and sat beside her. What do you think? Lily looked down at the brochure again. I think you already do most of this stuff. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What stuff? Helping people. She shrugged as if the answer were obvious. You just do it one person at a time. The observation stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Meanwhile, Richard Sterling continued expanding several foundation initiatives. Yet despite dozens of meetings and ongoing projects, he found himself wondering whether Ethan would accept the invitation. Most people would have responded immediately. Ethan had not. Strangely, Richard respected that. A rushed answer would have felt out of character. The following Saturday, Ethan attended one of the foundation's community events as an observer. No speeches. No commitments. Just an opportunity to see the program firsthand. Young students moved between workshops while volunteers offered guidance and encouragement. The atmosphere felt genuine. Nothing about it seemed designed for publicity. Richard noticed Ethan standing near the back of the room and walked over. "What do you think?" Ethan watched a volunteer helping a teenager prepare for a scholarship interview. "I think it matters." Richard smiled. "That is why we do it." For the next 2 hours, Ethan quietly moved through the event. He spoke with students, listened to mentors, observed interactions. Nobody treated him as special. Most people had no idea who he was. He preferred it that way. At one point, a teenage boy approached a table where Ethan happened to be standing. The student appeared nervous about an upcoming interview. Ethan listened carefully before offering a few simple suggestions. Nothing dramatic. Just practical advice about preparation, honesty, and confidence. 10 minutes later, the student walked away smiling. Richard happened to witness the exchange. The reaction confirmed everything he already suspected. Ethan did not inspire people because of titles. He inspired them because he genuinely cared. Later that afternoon, as the event concluded, Richard approached him one final time. "Have you made a decision?" Ethan looked across the room where volunteers were cleaning up supplies. Then he thought about Lily. The bag. The photograph. The unexpected chain of events that connected two completely different lives. Finally, he nodded. "I can help." Richard smiled. Not because he gained a volunteer. Not because he solved a problem. But because he knew the people entering those programs would benefit from someone whose actions matched his principles. As Ethan drove home that evening, Lily listened carefully while he described the day. When he finished, she smiled and looked out the window. "Funny." Ethan glanced at her. "What is funny?" Lily grinned. "You tried returning one lost bag." She paused. "And somehow ended up finding a whole new purpose instead." 6 months later, almost nobody connected the foundation's growing success to a forgotten leather bag found beside a coffee shop. Yet Ethan Brooks remembered the moment often. Not because it changed his financial situation. It did not. Not because it transformed him into someone different. It did not do that either. The real change was far quieter. The simple decision to do the right thing had opened a door he never knew existed. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Ethan stood inside a community center watching students participate in one of the foundation's mentorship programs. The room was filled with conversation, encouragement, and possibility. Several young people Ethan had met months earlier now carried themselves differently. More confident. More focused. More hopeful. The transformation was subtle, but real. Nearby, Richard Sterling observed the scene from across the room. The billionaire had built companies worth billions of dollars. He had negotiated major acquisitions. Led thousands of employees. Solved problems most people would never encounter. Yet few accomplishments brought him the satisfaction he felt watching young people gain opportunities they might otherwise have missed. Eventually he walked over to Ethan. "You were right." Ethan looked confused. "About what?" Richard smiled. "The important things." Ethan laughed softly. "I do not remember saying anything important." Richard shook his head. "You showed it." The conversation ended there. It did not need further explanation. Across the room, Lily was helping younger students organize materials for an upcoming workshop. At 13 years old, she had become a familiar face at many foundation events. People liked her because she carried the same quiet kindness her father demonstrated every day. Later that afternoon, one of the scholarship recipients approached Ethan. The young man looked nervous. Grateful. Determined. He explained that receiving support through the program had changed the direction of his life. Then he thanked Ethan for believing in him. After the student walked away, Ethan stood silently for several seconds. He had spent years fixing broken equipment, repairing damaged property, and solving practical problems. Those things mattered. Yet helping someone believe in their future felt different. More meaningful somehow. As evening approached, volunteers began cleaning the facility. Students headed home. Families gathered in parking lots. The event gradually came to an end. Ethan and Lily walked toward their car together beneath the fading orange light of sunset. The atmosphere felt peaceful. Familiar. Lily carried a small box of leftover program materials while Ethan held the door open for her. Before getting inside, she stopped and looked up at him. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan smiled. "Of course." Lily thought carefully. "If you found that bag again, would you do anything differently?" Ethan considered the question for a moment. Then he shook his head. "Not a single thing." Lily nodded. As if she already knew the answer. They climbed into the car and began the drive home. Across town, Richard Sterling stood alone in his office for a few minutes before leaving for the evening. On a shelf behind his desk sat the photograph of his mother. Safe. Protected. Recovered because one man chose integrity when nobody was watching. Richard looked at the picture and smiled. Then he turned off the office lights and headed home. Somewhere along the way, a billionaire recovered something precious. A single father discovered a new purpose. And a young girl learned that the right decision does not become valuable because someone rewards it. It becomes valuable because it was the right decision from the very beginning.